We're starting our notes today talking about the guillotine. This is perhaps something you've heard of before. It does not exist until this point in history. And so I've got two video clips for you to watch. There's three questions I have for you to look out for. I want you to be able to answer these questions by the end of these two video clips. First, why was this method of execution better than what currently existed? Two, how does this method of execution relate to the Enlightenment? And three, who makes the vital improvement to make the guillotine so effective?
On a hot August day in 1788, France's high executioner Charles-Henri Sanson ascended the scaffold to carry out the execution of a man by breaking on the wheel. The assembled mob of onlookers suddenly rushed the scaffold and freed the condemned man. The scaffold and wheel were smashed and set on fire. When news of the riot reached the palace, King Louis XVI, now sensing the impending revolt, granted the prisoner a full pardon and abolished the wheel throughout France. 3 years later, after the fall of the Bastille, the National Assembly sought a new execution method to be used on all people sentenced to death, regardless of rank or class.
Ever since the time of the French Revolution, people have decided that capital punishment should be the end of life as opposed to infliction of pain.
A committee was formed. At its head was Dr. Antoine Louis, physician to the king and secretary to the Academy of Surgery. Also on the committee was Dr. Joseph Ignace Guillotin, a professor of anatomy at the Faculty of Medicine in Paris. Guillotin and the others had been influenced by earlier beheading machines, such as the Scottish Maiden, the Italian Mania, and the Halifax Gibet.
It was a very crude guillotine of the time. The blade, it was not sharp, it was more just a big metal chunk, and it would knock the head off or crush the neck.
Sketches and plans were submitted. Two major improvements were the result. First was a convex or crescent-shaped blade. The second was the lunette, little moon, a hinged two-part yoke which immobilized the victim's neck.
The guillotine was invented with the notion that the blade would quickly sever the head with absolute assurance, and it was believed at the time that that would end life instantly.
The crescent shape was soon replaced by an angular blade. According to one historian's account, this sloping blade design was the idea of the king himself, Louis XVI. Upon seeing the sketches, the king, an amateur locksmith, well known for his mechanical aptitude, insisted that the shape of the convex blade was all wrong. Grabbing a pen, the king sketched in a triangular blade with a beveled edge. He contended that this blade would cut much cleaner and could accommodate virtually any size neck. These elements were incorporated into the final design. The new machine was tested on cadavers and cattle, and finally deemed ready to be put into service. On April 25th of 1792, the first man to die under its blade was a thief and assassin named Jacques-Nicolas Pelletier. The crowds marveled at the machine's deadly speed and precision. Soon a steady stream of victims would be hauled up the scaffold to meet the new modern machine.
This is an image of the guillotine, made popular in the 18th century by the French Revolution, and during that time, it was the quickest way to go. Of all the ways that one can be executed, the guillotine was the most humane. In my opinion, there's no question about it. The guillotine was created because manual beheading was inconsistent at best. And when we say manual beheading, we're talking about a guy with an axe. There were very famous cases of very famous people who had their heads lopped off by an executioner with an axe. And it took quite a number of blows before the executioner got through the neck. So the guillotine was created in an effort to, if you will, make beheading more humane. A guillotine is really nothing more than a giant razor blade in a frame. The victim was placed so that his head was directly beneath the blade, generally on a tree stump or something like that. The blade was designed on an angle because it's a lot easier to get through the skin, the muscle, the connective tissue, the bone of the neck, millimeter by millimeter. The blade went through the neck in literally 1/100th of a second. Death was as instantaneous and as painless as death could possibly be. Now, I imagine that having to walk up onto the platform and lay one's head down on the stump was pretty horrifying and not a very pleasant experience. But insofar as the actual act of being killed, I can't imagine a quicker and more painless way to go. I suppose one of the most frequently asked questions about being beheaded by a guillotine is, does consciousness persist in the brain after it's been severed from the body? Neuroscience has taught us that the brain has probably 5, 6, perhaps even 7 seconds worth of reserves to continue metabolism after blood supply has been cut off. That may not seem like a long time until you do this. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. That's got to be a really long time to realize that your head has just been removed from your body. If you did want to study this, I suppose you'd have to convince the victim to communicate with you. And so, you'd pick up the head right after it's been severed, you turn it around, you look right into its eyes and say, "Hey, are you in there?" And I'll blink once for yes and twice for no. And admittedly, either answer is going to indicate that there's some consciousness. Since it's unlikely that we're going to formally study this in the United States anytime soon, we're going to have to leave this to speculation.
So this is a tabletop model of the guillotine that was used by Dr. Antoine Joseph, who was the doctor for the king, to show what Dr. Guillotine had suggested. So this is actually in a museum about the French Revolution in France. And it becomes totally associated with the French Revolution. And so it's with this new method of killing people that we begin the radical phase of the revolution. We call it the radical phase because what we've seen so far, from the discussion at the meeting of the Estates General, even to Bastille Day and the creation of the Constitution in 1791, for the most part, things have been pretty tame. But they're going to start to get more extreme, not just because of the guillotine, but people's beliefs and their viewpoints are getting more extreme. So that's why we call this the radical phase. An important group in this story is the Jacobins, or in French, Jacobins. The Jacobins were a political club, what we might call a political party today. And they began back in 1789, and they are trying to speak for the rights of the common man, what I have been calling Pierre Pig Farmer. They called these people the sans-culottes, or sans-culottes. Culottes today are a type of kind of blousy shorts. Sans means without. So what this term sans culotte is referring to is the people who are regular people, who wear regular pants, like this guy in the picture. They don't wear the fancy pants. This is in reference to the bourgeoisie. Remember, when the meeting of the Estates General happens in May of 1789, the representatives of the Third Estate, they are almost entirely bourgeoisie people. They are not the majority of the country. So the Jacobins are champions for the sans-culotte, the non-fancy pants people, and they want the regular people to be heard in French society and government. And they feel that the constitution that has been created is not sufficient. By only allowing partial participation in the system, because it is based on property ownership, that's what lets you vote. They say that's not enough. What about all the people who don't own property? So they say the elections, the result of the Constitution of 1791, were insufficient. In these new elections, they want to see universal male suffrage. Every adult man can vote regardless of property status. The Jacobins want to eliminate the monarchy. So this is getting a little bit more extreme. So far we have seen continued discussion of a kingdom or the role of the king in this new system. But the Jacobins say just get rid of the king entirely. And this would require a new constitution, because the constitution as it stood kept the king as part of that executive branch. So the Jacobins, they are the extremists in this story. And there's two people in the Jacobins that I want you to know about. The first one is named Maximilien Robespierre. His story, he comes from a small town called Arras, A-R-R-A-S, comes from a poor family, but he has the opportunity to go to school and get an education, and that totally changes things for him. He ultimately will study and become a lawyer. But he has a past with King Louis XVI. Back in 1774, when Louis becomes the king, Robespierre's school was chosen to make a speech on the occasion of the coronation, the ceremony in which he is crowned king. And so the students in this school had essentially an essay contest, and whoever wrote the best essay would get to deliver the speech to the king and queen. Well, Maximilien Robespierre, excellent student, he wins the essay contest, and he is chosen to deliver a speech on the day of the coronation. So imagine the royal couple. They have been up since who knows when, getting ready for this really fancy religious ceremony. They are wearing pounds of jewelry and robes and everything. And little teenage Robespierre comes up. He kneels. The king and queen are sitting in a carriage, in a coach. And little Maximilien Robespierre makes his speech talking about how happy the people are about this new king, and he's pouring his heart into it, and he looks up, and the king and queen are dozing off. So this will leave Robespierre with a pretty negative view of the king and queen. In his studies, Robespierre really liked the ideas that Rousseau was talking about. Rousseau talked about what he called revolutionary virtue, meaning that the goodness of the people could change society. Robespierre interprets it a little bit differently. He will really see revolution as an action needed by the people to change the government. And this, of course, will be through democracy and the involvement of the people. And he has a chance to get involved. In 1789, he is chosen to represent his town at the meeting of the Estates Generals. So he goes to that meeting in spring 1789. And he is there in those weeks of deadlock when they say, you know what, let's become the true representatives of the country, the National Assembly. So he is a member of the National Assembly. Technically, we would consider him bourgeoisie because he was a lawyer. He was from a professional occupation. But he still has that association with the poorest in the country. So this explains sort of why he is a Jacobin speaking up for the sans-culottes. And amongst his colleagues, he becomes known as the Incorruptible, that he was so pure in his reasons, so driven by these ideologies of making things better, getting the people improved. The people nickname him the Incorruptible. With a nickname like that, it's almost guaranteed that you will be corrupted. So a little bit of foreshadowing there. The other guy who's a part of the Jacobins that I want you to know about is Georges Danton, who has an absolutely massive noggin. Like just a huge head. It's incredibly impressive. Sort of a similar story to Robespierre, comes from a very poor family, but well-respected, gets educational opportunities. He's not part of the Estates General. He's not in the National Assembly, but in 1789, he's living in Paris, and he's there at the Bastille. And so the people, the regular people, the sans-culottes, they know him. They probably recognize him because they can see his giant head, but he becomes well-known amongst the regular people that this is a guy who's on our side. This is a lawyer. This is an educated guy, and he speaks for us, the people. So in the new constitution, when the new government is established with the different branches, Danton is named as Minister of Justice. So we've got these two guys, Robespierre and Danton, who have come to these positions of power in the government by the time we get to 1792. They end up ultimately kind of on slightly different paths, because within the National Assembly, there are growing political parties. Now, these Jacobins were part of both of these political parties, but you'll see in a second that they're going to have slight differences of opinion that will become incredibly important. So one of the parties within the assembly is called the Mountain. They're actually called this because they sat sort of high up in the bleachers, if you will, in the room the National Assembly met in, and they sort of were looming over everyone else as if they were sitting on top of a mountain. They could be described as radical Republicans, meaning they want pure representation. They want everyone to vote. They want to get rid of the king. They think this should be pure democracy. The king has messed everything up, so we should just eliminate him entirely. Still, members of the Jacobins are part of this other group, the Girondists, and these people are named more after a location, Girondin. They still like the idea of a republic. They want people involved. They want the voice of the people heard, but they are much less extreme. They think, hey, we shouldn't kill the king because, he's not a great guy, but he didn't cause all of these problems. And getting rid of the king, even if we don't kill him, even if we just eliminate his role, it doesn't actually fit, or doesn't fix, the problems that France has. So we would consider them more moderate. So we're in 1792. We left off with the royal family's failed escape to Varennes. They now live under essentially house arrest, but they're in the Tuileries Palace in the middle of Paris, so their quality of life is still pretty good. The king is still participating in the government. He is attending the meetings of the National Assembly. And in April of 1792, the National Assembly decides to declare war on. Remember, previously we talked about how Austria and Prussia have the Declaration of Pillnitz. This is intended to have Austria and Prussia restore the monarchy to full power. Well, part of the reason the National Assembly declares war on Austria and Prussia is they don't want that to happen. But they also want food. They think if we go to war with these places, we might be able to loot their stores of grain or take over their land. But the king, as part of the National Assembly, he is part of this decision. Probably is not a huge fan of this decision, but he's just trying to stay a part of the game. He's trying to stay relevant. As the national government is getting involved in wars, the city government, the Parisian government, is far more extreme than the national government. And there's lots of Jacobins in the city government who think that the National Assembly is too moderate, that the king should be eliminated, and these extremists in Paris want massive, massive change. They are not satisfied with the changes that have happened so far. Now, I love this cartoon. This cartoon is called sort of like skimming out the Jacobins. So if you look closely, we see lots of those revolutionary caps. These are people in the Jacobin club, but the extremists felt that the bourgeoisie had too much influence. They want the regular people, the sans-culottes, to really be leading this movement. So we see this guy, he's trying to strain out the wealthy people. You can see the gold coins falling out. And this is what the extremists want, to get rid of any hints of the old system, to be totally reliant on what the people want. So this tension has been building for several months. France is at war with Austria and Prussia. The people of Paris are incredibly frustrated. And in August of 1792, a mob of Parisians attacks the palace where the royals live, the Tuileries Palace, located in the heart of the city. This mob gets into the palace and actually kills a few hundred of the royal Swiss guards. These Swiss guards, the Swiss are famous for their military prowess. Swiss guards are often hired to protect very important people, including the Pope. And there are several hundred of these Swiss guards who are trying to protect the royal family, but are killed by the mob. And to this day, there's actually a memorial to these Swiss guards in Switzerland, in the city of Lausanne, I believe. And the royal family literally has to run for their lives away from the mob. They run to the National Assembly. They ask, please, will you help us? You are the government. You have to protect us. Now, just to give you a sense of how they're able to run to the National Assembly, if you look at the area circled in blue, those are the royal apartments in the Palace of the Tuileries, up on those upper levels. In red, in the lower levels of the same building, is where the National Assembly is meeting. Now, this is a very, very large building, but at least it's all in one building. So this is what makes it possible for the royal family to run away from the mob and beg the National Assembly for protection. For a couple of days, the royal family is sort of at the mercy of the National Assembly. The National Assembly is trying to figure out what do they do. And it's the Jacobins in the National Assembly, the extremists, especially those members of the Mountain Party, who think that this is their opportunity to get rid of the king. So what they do is they say, okay, we'll protect you, Your Majesty, and they put the royal family into the temple. Now, this was formerly the location, the headquarters of the Knights Templar, but since, the 1400s had become a prison. So it's another big stone building that's easy to protect. So at this point, the royal family they're imprisoned. And just to check in with our maps, we've got the Bastille on the very far right. In the middle, that's the Hotel de Ville, where the National Assembly had been meeting, and Louis comes and kisses the flag in July 1789. On the left, we have the Tuileries Palace, where they have been living for the last 2.5, 3 years. And then now here is the Temple prison. So again, it's all pretty centrally located. So the royal family is transferred here to the Temple prison. They're told it's for their safety, but they really now are prisoners of the National Assembly, prisoners of the government. Meanwhile, back in the National Assembly, the extremists, the extremist Jacobins, the members of the Mountain, they say, we don't have a king. And they argue that actually back when the royal family tried to escape to Austria, the failed escape to Varennes, that was essentially the king abdicating his power, giving up his throne. And therefore, if there is no king, it is possible for France to fully be a republic. And they say, if this is the case, the Constitution we have, the National Assembly we have, this is the result of a system that involves a king. So we need to have an entirely new election with an entirely new legislature voted in. They want universal suffrage, so they'll get universal suffrage. And when they have these new elections, we have a new, slightly different name. Instead of being the National Assembly, they are now called the National Convention. And this helps us distinguish between the results of the Estates General Meeting in 1789, how these were elected representatives from around the country, mainly bourgeoisie types, to now the National Convention. Everyone, the sans-culottes, the regular Pierre pig farmers, have had a chance to have their voice heard. And so this is the National Convention. This mob rule continues into the month of September, where we've got these extremists who are they're bloodthirsty. These foreign armies, meaning the Austrians and the Prussians, are on their way to Paris, and their goal is to open up the prisons and free those noble or clergy members who are currently imprisoned. Remember, this goes back to the Declaration of Pillnitz. They said they wanted to restore the monarchy. Well, the people are assuming that means restore all of the Ancien regime. So this bloodthirsty mob doesn't want this to happen. So in order to prevent the freeing of the prisoners, the mob goes to the prisons and kills the prisoners themselves. So they're killing people who are entirely innocent. Their only crime was being born noble. And one of these prisoners is a woman named the Princess de Lamballe. This was actually Marie Antoinette's best friend. She was famous for her red hair. Of course, here we see her in one of those powdered wigs. But this bloodthirsty crowd, they kill her. Of course, they cut off her head. They put it on a pike. But then they take it to a hairdresser and say, fix her hair, do her makeup. And then they take the Princess de Lamballe's head on a pike to the Temple prison to try and get Marie Antoinette to see it, to show Marie Antoinette, who is considered no longer to be the queen, but just a citizen like anyone else. This is what happens to nobles. This is what happens to the enemies of the people.